Okay, so now that we know how to do a forward pass to calculate the projected time and a backward pass to identify the critical path, let's learn how to calculate the slack time or float. They're the same thing and are used interchangeably depending on who you talk to. Some tasks in your project will not have slack and others will, but simply stated, total slack is the maximum amount of time a task can be delayed without delaying the project end date. This is a useful tool that a project manager has, and it allows you the possibility of shifting resources temporarily to assist another part of the project that may be falling behind. It's extremely valuable and shouldn't be wasted. Tasks or activities in the critical path will not have slack, so this is something that you need to keep in mind. To calculate the total slack, you subtract either the late finish minus the early finish or the late start minus the early start. It produces the same result. But for this example, we're going to use the late finish and the early finish. Typically, you write the total float above each box. So for activity A, subtracting the late finish from the early finish, you get 0. Moving to box C, if you take the late finish of 30 and subtract the early finish of 30, you get 0. You can start to see a trend here. For task or activity E, the late finish minus the early finish is also 0. For F, the late finish minus the early finish is 0. For G, the late finish minus the early finish of 110 equals 0. And for H, we get the same result. The late finish minus the early finish of 110 each gives you 0. So if you look at the diagram, the existing total slack is 0 along the critical path, which is the top part. If you delay any task in this sequence, you're going to delay your project. So now let's finish the other part. And we think that that's the critical path and we know there's no slack. Using the formula, if we go back to activity B and we subtract the late finish minus the early finish, we get a total slack of 80. If we move to task D and subtract the late finish minus the early finish, we get a total slack of 80 as well. And since B feeds into D and together they only take 20 minutes to complete, they can be delayed by 80 minutes and they won't affect the end date of the project. But if they're delayed by 81 minutes, just 1 minute more, it's going to delay the entire project. So now we've discussed total slack. And what does that actually mean? It means the amount of time that you can delay a particular activity in your project without delaying the end time or end date of your project. And it varies. Keeping in mind that the total slack in the critical path is 0. Anything that deviates from that critical path will delay your project. But the activities that are not in the critical path, you can delay based on the amount of slack time. Now keep in mind that as we go into our free slack, it's slightly different, but this also tells you which pieces are more important than others in the process and which will impact your overall timeline. So now we're going to talk about free slack.